Hello everyone, welcome to Economics. Today's session is regarding international trade. The focus is going to be on the benefits of trade, the import model, export model, and also the tariff model and trade restrictive policies. Let's get started with the phenomenon of international trade and how international trade has increased over the last 50 years around the world. Globalization has improved economic linkages among every country that is part of a trade agreement. And globalization has increased significantly all over the world for the last 50, 60 years to a greater extent. The amount of goods and services coming into the country, known as imports, has increased significantly for various countries, including the United States. And when imports are greater than exports, the country runs a trade deficit. Often cases, countries may export goods and services to different parts of the world, and if the exports are greater than the imports, a country is running a trade surplus. That is, they are selling more products to the rest of the world than they are importing. Often cases, people argue that we should have a balanced trade when the amount of exports and imports are equivalent to each other. Most of the time, countries are running either a trade deficit or a trade surplus. A country that is experiencing a trade deficit or high levels of imports may be consuming a lot more goods and services from the rest of the world, and it could be a high income consuming country. In the case of the United States has been running a trade deficit for the last 50 years and is not going anywhere anytime soon, primarily because we as consumers, we consume a lot from all over the world. So a trade deficit will continue regardless of administration. The theory of comparative advantage helps explain why international trade occurs and why it's beneficial to the economy and to multiple countries or several countries involved in international trade. From the view of economics, international trade is beneficial to the members involved or the countries involved because it increases the flow of transactions and the flow of goods and services in and out of the country or in and out of the countries involved in international trade. And according to the theory of comparative advantage specifically specifies that a country has a comparative advantage in producing a good or service if the country has the lowest opportunity cost of producing the good or service than for any other country. That is, if you have the lowest cost of production, produce the product, specialize in the production of the good. Conversely, there's a view of absolute advantage when countries or a nation or any particular individual or business is most efficient at producing a good or service given its current resources. It can produce more of everything. And often the common view is that if a country has an absolute advantage, an absolute power, the absolute ability to produce every good, then it should produce it rather than trading with someone else. And that's absolute advantage, absolute abilities to produce. However, the theory of comparative advantage makes it clear that if a country has the lowest opportunity cost, produce that product, specialize in that good, and then trade with a different country for mutual gains. Absolute advantages, no. We have to produce everything domestically. We have all of the resources, all of the productivity factors. Let's produce domestically. And comparative advantage is a little bit more towards full specialization and trade with each other and do not remain in autarky, which is self-sufficiency, the point of no trade, the point of producing everything within the country. Everything has to be done within the country's domestic borders and no trade with someone else. Don't trade with a different part of the world. Autarky, point of no trade. Most countries are not no longer in autarky. That's 200 to 300 years ago. And even then, people used to engage in trade. Countries used to engage in trade, and it has been evolving over time. So to undo development and progress, it will be quite counterproductive. We're going to assume a hypothetical example between the United States and Mexico, which are members of the international treaty, the North American Free Trade Agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And for this example, we're going to assume that they produce two goods and services, auto parts and airplanes, using the production possibilities frontier. And the models for the possibilities frontier is going to be straight lines for constant returns, and the models are going to be representative of the United States and of Mexico, respectively. So here we have the United States production possibilities frontier. We have the United States Possibilities Frontier, which is the representing the United States economy, producing airplanes and auto parts. The United States, under Autarky, point of self-sufficiency, produces its own goods for its domestic borders, and consumers consume their own goods for its domestic borders. Domestic production and domestic consumption. The United States has the ability to produce airplanes and auto parts, and currently is consuming a consumption bundle for the U.S. of 1,000 airplanes and 500 auto parts. It is meeting the needs of its citizens, and it may not need to trade with Mexico, which is here producing under Autarky, the production possibilities under Autarky, is also able to produce, in this case, airplanes, only 1,000 and 2,000 auto parts respectively. And is currently operating at 500 planes and 1,000 auto parts. If both countries remain under Autarky, point of no trade, they break relationships, they close their borders, don't trade with each other, self-sufficient, then they are able to meet the productivity of their society and state in self-sufficiency. But the theory of comparative advantage states that even though they can do and choose to not trade with each other, it may be better and most beneficial for them to specialize, in which they have an opportunity cost that is lower, and then trade with one another for mutual gains. Both of them could end up better off. So if we focus on the theory of comparative advantage, we're going to analyze the opportunity cost of production of each country, the United States and Mexico, and see which country has the lowest opportunity cost in the production of auto parts and in the production of airplanes, and then decide whether or not they should trade. So in the model 1 here, we have the United States Production Possibilities Frontier, currently in Autarky, point of no trade, 1,000 planes and 500 auto parts. Mexico in Autarky, point of no trade, 500 planes and 1,000 auto parts. At the bottom corner here, I have the opportunity cost calculation for the United States and the opportunity cost calculation for Mexico on the right bottom side. And whichever country has the lowest opportunity cost in the production of either good should specialize in the production of the good in which the country has the lowest opportunity cost, and then trade with one another. If you want to think about it in terms of cost of production, whichever country can produce it at a lower cost, at a cheaper level, produce the product there, and then trade with one another, if you want to take a look at it in that perspective. Here we're looking at the opportunity cost of auto production. Auto productions. If we produce autos, it goes in the bottom axis, which have 1,000 autos that can be produced, and a maximum production of this. We're assuming full specialization. Maximum production of autos is 1,000. To produce 1,000 autos, we have to divert resources and give up the production of airplanes. So airplane goes on top, and we are giving up 2,000 airplanes to produce 1,000 autos, or a ratio of 2 to 1. And the opportunity cost here is -2. The opportunity cost of producing one auto is 2 planes. For the airplane production, if we're producing airplanes in the US, airplanes is the one in question right now. We have to invert the axis. So we have plane production, which is 2,000 planes, produce maximum production of 2,000 planes. We have to decrease the production of autos by 1,000. So we have 1,000 over 2,000. The opportunity cost of producing airplanes is 1/2. Or for every one plane produced, we give up the production of autos by 1/2. In the case of Mexico, the opportunity cost of auto production, they can produce up to 2,000. So we produce autos, we produce 2,000 autos. We have to give up airplanes, which is a maximum of 1,000. So we have 1,000 airplanes are given up to produce 2,000 autos, or it's the equivalent to 1/2. The opportunity cost of airplane production, we produce 1,000 airplanes. Airplanes are the ones being produced. We produce 1,000 airplanes. We have to decrease the production of autos by 2,000, so that's why you have that negative. And the opportunity cost of airplane production is for every one airplane produced, we give up 2 autos in the production process. When we compare both of them side by side, whichever country has the lowest opportunity cost in the production of autos, for example, US and Mexico, will specialize in the production of the good in which they have the lowest opportunity cost. In this case, Mexico, in absolute value, has the lowest opportunity cost, and the production of autos is 1/2 in comparison to 2. And the US has the lowest opportunity cost in airplane production, which is 1/2 in comparison to 2 in Mexico. Um, and the US will specialize in airplane production, given that it has the lowest cost. And Mexico will specialize in automaking, which it has the lowest cost, and then trade with one another. And in real life, the US does produce one of the finest planes in the world, airplane production, which is in this case, for example, produced by Boeing Corporation, one of the leading companies in the airline industry. And Mexico does have a lot of labor to supply and produce auto parts. Now, the terms of trade are going to be somewhere in between 1,000 to 2,000 airplanes. The U.S. will not trade anything less than what they can already produce domestically, which is 1,000. So they're going to keep a little bit more than 1,000. So they're going to keep here, in this case, 1,250 planes out of the 2,000, and the remaining 750 are going to be traded to Mexico, which Mexico gets 750 planes. The 750 comes from the U.S. The U.S. keeps 1,250 out of the 2,000 and trades 750 airplanes in exchange for auto parts. How many auto parts is the U.S. Is Mexico producing? 2,000. Out of those 2,000, Mexico is going to keep more than what they produce domestically, which is 1,000. So they keep here 1,250, and they have the remaining 750 traded to the U.S. in exchange for 750 airplanes. When both of them agree to trade with each other, they consume more than they were under Autarky. The United States consumes 250 planes and 750 autos with trade, which is a lot more, significantly more than what they were consuming in Autarky, point of no trade, closing off the borders, domestic production. And Mexico consumes more airplanes, 750, and more auto parts with trade. And we have realized gains from trade accrue to both countries if they fully specialize in what they have the lowest opportunity cost in. It's important to recognize that a specialization can yield higher benefits between multiple countries, multiple parties, and total output can increase. So in this case, it could be beneficial for both the United States and Mexico to maintain their international relations in trade. Even though some people are in favor of domestic production, which is arguably okay sometimes. Now, what provides countries with comparative advantage or low costs in the production of goods? Well, some countries have international differences in climate. Some countries are endowed with different climates, with different abilities to produce based on their tropical regions, the location of where they're located in the earth. So, for example, we get winter deliveries from Chile to the United States during the winter season. If you look at the north side of the United States, it's relatively cold. So even if you want to produce things, goods and services, you can, because, for example, Chicago is frozen during the winter season. So you need to import some goods from either other part of the world or within the country. So we get roses from Colombia to the U.S. also during winter for Valentine's Day, and Colombia does supply one of the most beautiful roses to the Americas and also to Europe. Technology plays a big factor in comparative advantage. It provides for effective production, increases productivity, and lowers costs and makes things more productive. Another main factor is the factor availability and factor endowments within a country. Some countries are naturally endowed differently with factor endowments in terms of what they have immediately available within the country in order to produce goods and services. Heckscher-Ohlflin specifically stated that nations naturally differ in the availability of resource and factor endowments available within the country. Often cases, nations have more resources, more minerals, more endowments of certain of certain goods or of certain things that other nations do not. So it gives them an advantage in the production of those goods, and they export those goods to other nations. For example, we may have labor-intensive goods that require a lot of labor, and there's a lot of labor-intensive industries. For example, the case of Bangladesh producing clothing. China has a lot of labor, and for a long time, China used to have a lot of labor to produce and export a lot of goods and services to the rest of the world. It still does it to a certain degree. Guatemala And the list goes on in terms of countries that are labor intensive that produce thousands of goods. We have land intensive natural resources that are essential and in abundance in certain countries. For example, one of the goods that Brazil has is, for example, in this case, bananas. Other countries also produce bananas. Orchids from Ecuador, one of the most beautiful ones. Natural resources, for example, abundance in crude oil from Saudi Arabia or from the Middle East. One of the biggest natural reserves are in the Middle East. So nations naturally differ in terms of what they immediately have available in order to export or specialize on. The US has capital intensive based goods, which means that the US requires a lot of human capital, knowledge, and expertise. It's no longer a labor intensive manufacturing industry. That's not the case of the United States anymore, regardless if you attempt to bring it back. It's not going to happen in the United States. It's in the technology capital intensive sector. So it's important to recognize economic shifts and economic changes over time. If we look at the beginning of economic activity, we need to focus first with a domestic economy, because a domestic economy can remain closed. Even if it has all of those advantages or the endowments of technology, in climate, and so on, it can either stay in autarky or it can open its relationships to the rest of the world. This model indicates the consumer demand on their domestic markets and the domestic supply on their domestic markets with an economy that is in autarky. So under an economy under autarky, the price in autarky, equilibrium in autarky, and quantity in autarky, domestic suppliers satisfy domestic demand. If you have domestic producers, you have domestic consumers, and that's it. You have no access to the international consumer. Your domestic consumers buy your domestic supply of goods by the suppliers, and they receive a consumer surplus or consumer benefit from buying your local goods only. And your domestic suppliers receive a producer benefit or revenue from selling the product to the market in domestic markets only to domestic consumers. This is more or less a closed economy. Assume that we make all of the cars in the United States domestically, and you can only consume domestic. Buy domestic and produce domestic. Produce domestic and buy domestic. This is what this model is indicating. When the market is open to international trade or open to international community or international goods, consumer surplus and producer surplus will change, and the equilibrium price will also change. It's important to recognize that if you decide to open your economy, you become an international member of the community, and when a market opens to international trade, there becomes to be competition between producers, importers, exporters, and the price of the good or service adjusts. Whatever the price was is going to adjust. It's either going to be more or less than what your domestic price was, and it's going to create a world price or a price in the world. It's going to equate. Goods and services are going to be traded in a world price. And if the world price is less than the autarky domestic price, trade is going to lead to imports. If the price in the world, once you open your economy, is significantly less for the goods and services that your domestic suppliers are producing, is less by being produced somewhere else, the economy is going to import the products from a different location. And this happened significantly over the last 50, 60 years when economies started to globalize. They can access the international markets, international production, international labor, international resources, and they realize that they can import products from all over. So let's take a look at what happens when we have the import model and how the import model indicates the quantity of imports that can come from abroad. So suppose here we have the price of auto parts or automobiles in general. The demand for automobiles, think about Ford Motor Company, one of the American companies in the United States. Your domestic consumers demand Ford Motor Company products. And your domestic suppliers was GM, General Motors, and Ford. That's it. And the equilibrium price was $1,000, just assume $1,000 for the domestic price, and quantity in equilibrium was 1,000 units. Your domestic suppliers meet the domestic demand. That's it. But once you open the market to international trade or to international community, you can start buying products from different parts of the world, like a Honda from a different part of different country, a Toyota, so different products. So if you open the market, and if the world price is less, the price in the world is less than your Autarky price here, price in the world is going to be $700 for a $700 car. Your consumers, the quantity demanded, the quantity consumed is going to increase. Quantity demanded increases from 1,000 units to a greater number. With lower prices, the law of demand states with a decrease in price, consumers increase the quantity demanded. And with a lower price, your domestic suppliers are going to decrease the quantity supply of the good because they now face a lower price, which means lower benefit for the product. They now have to compete with the foreign sector at lower prices. Some producers may not survive. They may close off and shut down, or simply they cut production because the price is too low. And that's a matter of concern, because if businesses cut supply, they cut employment, they shut for business, and now they're competing with the foreign sector, and people are quite critical on that perspective. So let's take a look at what happens here. With the lower price in the world for auto parts, or auto of $700, consumers are demanding domestic quantity demand that is 1,300 units. They demand more than the equilibrium quantity in domestic closed scenarios. With international markets, the consumer wants 1,300, but the domestic suppliers are only supplying 700 units because the price is lower, but that's offset here with the extra quantity demanded, the excess quantity demanded is satisfied with imports. So the difference between quantity demanded minus quantity supply, it's imported, which is 600 imports. And if you notice, imports are just as much as what's been produced now, and we have 1,300 units to satisfy consumption. So that means here that the consumer is better off with imports because we buy a lot of products from all over, not just auto parts, clothing, appliances, shoes, phones, computers. All of those are mainly imported from abroad, and the consumer benefits greatly. The producers domestically are affected because now they are facing competition from the rest of the world, and that's the concern. So who wins and loses with imports? The consumer wins, and the producer domestically is affected. So in Autarky, we have the domestic price. It's a lot lower. Consumer benefit and producer benefit. If the price in the world is lower and you can buy the product at a lower price somewhere else, or import it and sell it to the consumer at a lower price, if you notice the consumer price at a lower price in the world, let's focus on the domestic demand. The consumers are going to demand greater units, which are going to be imported. Part of it is going to be imported, and the consumer will benefit by having lower prices, more products from various locations at a lower price, and access to international markets. And the consumer gains are going to be represented by the area blue, which is consumer surplus 1, consumer surplus 2, and consumer surplus CSC. This is consumer surplus that was not there before but is now there because we have access to imports, and those imports provide the consumers some form of benefit at a lower price. So all of the consumer benefit will be the blue area that is highlighted within this triangular shape. The producer, which has cut production or cut supply, quantity supply of units due to the lower price, is going to experience a smaller benefit, which is going to decrease. The consumer producer benefit, the producer benefit is going to decline to just this small area, pink area. The consumer gains are greater and quite substantial at the expense of domestic producers. So the gains to the consumer are significant with imports. And if we want to reduce the amount of imports, we as consumers, we have to decrease our consumption. And that's not going to happen anytime soon, anybody. Those of you that are quite critical as the dependency of imports, it's important to recognize that some nations do become highly dependent on imports. But if the consumer continues buying goods and services, we're going to continue running a trade deficit for a long time. And governments have attempted to reduce the amount of imports from abroad. The administration has done it heavily, but it's not going to happen for the last 50, 60 years, regardless of administration, imports keep coming in from different places. Now, if consumers benefit in the import sector, what benefits the domestic producers? Exports. If the world price is greater than the domestic price and you can sell your products in a different location, once you open the market to international trade, you can import or you can export products. And if the world price is greater than your domestic price, trade leads to the exportation of goods. International trade creates winners, creates consumer benefits, creates access to products, to resources from all over the world, and it also creates the import-export industry. While some businesses are affected, others are created, jobs are created, and the transition mechanism takes some time. In the export sector, producers will benefit. The higher the price of the good or service, the greater the ability of producers to increase production and export the product somewhere else at a greater price. So let's take a look at the export model and how with the higher world price than the domestic price, trade is going to lead to the exportation of goods. And one of the fundamental products that the U.S. exports is airplanes, along with other highly technological advanced products. So the airplanes from Boeing Corporation, here we have the domestic demand for domestic buyers, domestic consumers. The domestic supplier, which is Boeing, for example, of airplanes, can only sell their products to domestic consumers and they receive consumer benefit at an autarky price, self-sufficiency, closed economy, point of no trade of $2,000. For example, these are just hypothetical numbers to show the implications, and the quantity of 1,000 units. Once you open the market to international trade, the world price can be higher for airplanes or could be lower. And since the market is dominated by few multi-billion-dollar industries in the airplane, Boeing and Airbus and some other one in Latin America and Brazil, they can really benefit from selling their airplanes not only to domestic airlines or domestic consumers, but also to all of the Americas, to all over the world at a higher price. So if they can get a higher world price, if they open the economy to everyone, the price in the world for Boeing airplanes is going to be, in this case, $2,400 rather than $2,000. So at $2,400 in the world, Boeing, if you look at the supply, the production of the good can increase. Quantity supply, if you look at this point A to point on the supply curve, the red curve, quantity supply from 1,000, it increases to the right on the supply side. This model is indicating that with a higher price, the consumer may buy fewer units here of airplanes or airplane rides, but the focus is mainly on the producers. They are able to produce more. Quantity supply increases to 1,400 units. 1,400 units. So they were producing 1,000 in domestic markets to domestic consumers, selling them at 2,000. Now with the world access and open market, they can the suppliers can sell it at 2,400 and produce 1,400, which is significantly more. And if the quantity demanded domestically is only 600 units, quantity demanded at 2,400, 600 units, and producers are producing 1,400, the difference is exported to the rest of the world at a higher world price, or in this case, at a world price. It could be sold to anybody where the relationships have been established. With higher production, this is why often cases you may hear public officials or certain news claiming that exports are better, because once production increases, that exports may be better than imports, that once production increases, business activity increases, infrastructure increases, employment increases, jobs are created, infrastructure is developed, the community grows, and it promotes economic activity at the local, and then it has a significant effect at the macro scale. So a lot of people favor exports to be, one of the better indications rather than imports. Only if the entire economy is heavily dependent on the import-export sector. I mentioned earlier that the U.S. economy is not too significantly dependent on imports and exports. 93% of its economy is on the service sector, other than import-export. They play a big role, but not a heavy burden role. Some states do. Some states are heavily affected. So let's take a look here. Quantity supply increases to 1,400. Exports increase to the rest of the world. Producers increase production. The producers will have the higher benefit at a higher world price. If the world price increases above the autarky price, their production, if we focus on the production, quantity supply here, the production increases on the supply of goods. The producer benefit, all of this pink area, producer benefit, producer benefit, producer benefit, is going to increase. The producer benefit, the ability to produce increases, and they can sell their product at a higher price. The gains to the producer are significantly greater, and gains from trade are realized to the producer, while the consumer experiences a little bit less benefit. Imports benefit consumers greatly, all of us. If you like your flat screen TV, your phones, your computers, your cars, from all over, your amenities, then don't complain about the trade deficit, because the export sector benefits the consumers, the producers. The export sector benefits the producers, and the imports benefit us, the consumers. So there's winners and losers on both ends. Although the argument is that imports do have an effect on certain communities and certain employments, because you may have an exporting industry that sells products to international markets, and they can do really well and sell the products abroad and increase employment. But you may have import competing industries that are competing against the imports from abroad and really affect your local economy, distort jobs. Companies offshore their production, where they move completely to a different part of the world, and they move the operations, and jobs are lost when companies leave, or and they produce somewhere else. So the import competing industries can be affected. If you lower the price enough in the world, they start now competing with the foreign sector. There's a dumping behavior, cheap products, low labor costs, and so on. So if you really want to protect your industries against imports, there's trade restrictive policies that can be implemented. Although most governments follow a free trade, no government intervention to reduce imports or increase the amount of exports. They have a free trade agreement, free trade zones. For the most part, most governments implement free trade agreements, or trade agreements that are beneficial to the members involved. And you have different organizations that are responsible to monitor international trade treaties between different countries. If countries are really concerned, and the United States became really concerned in the last 4 years with different countries, specifically China and other parts of the world, in terms of the amount of imports coming into the country, produced abroad, produced domestically, and they're not being produced in the U.S., you can implement trade protective policies, restrictive policies on imports, setting extensive documentation, extensive requirements, extensive guidelines. You can ask them to voluntarily decline or restrict their imports, which is not going to happen. You can subsidize your producers to produce domestically and encourage consumers to buy domestically. Or you can set tariffs. The United States followed the tariff effect. They set a tariff, and the general tariff includes a revenue tariff and a protective tariff. The protective tariff is meant to protect your domestic industries against foreign competition and to encourage domestic production. A revenue tariff is when you tax products that are produced abroad and they're coming into the country, and you want to tax them because they are not producing your economy, and they may affect your local producers' products. For the most part, a general tariff does both. It collects revenue and it protects the industries against imports. And if you want to set an import quota, you can limit the amount of imports coming into the country. The United States took the stand of doing tariffs on trade, specifically on Chinese products and other countries, significantly in the last 3 years. And what it creates, it distorts the market, because countries can retaliate. You set a tariff, the other country can do the same. They can devalue their currency as well. They can change their exchange rate, lower the prices of their goods. It's not a best thing. The economy grows, the economy evolves, international trade flow of goods and services increase or decrease. There are companies that leave the States to move somewhere else, and jobs are lost in that community. But once they leave, they leave. You can encourage them to stay by giving them a better government subsidy or government incentive, or their wage program. But they're not going to come back anytime soon or that easy. There's a whole entire process of produce domestic and buy domestic. We do need to come and make companies responsible when they move somewhere else to assure the safety and security of the products, though. It's an important thing that that's done. So let's take a look at the effects of the tariff in the market. The tariff is essentially a tax levy on imports, regardless of who the company is. If they're produced in China, all of the companies importing products from China are going to be taxed and import. For example, like the iPhone that's produced in China, assembled in China. So owned by an American company that assembles it in China. And is released every year, right? It's the iPhone effect. Or your computers, your appliances, microwave, dishwashers, stoves, fridge, etc. They're produced somewhere else, where the tariff is set in place. It's going to increase the price to the consumer above the current price in the world. It's going to create a different price, and the price is going to be a price post-tariff. And that price is going to be a price after the tariff. You have the world price that you normally pay because it's produced somewhere else in the world, but now because of the tariff, you are going to have a different price. It's the price in the world plus the tariff, which is a tax. It's added on to the price, and guess who pays it? The consumer. The producers pass it on to the consumer. So if you don't mind reducing imports and having it produced somewhere else and be in favor of the tariff, well, be ready to pay a higher price, or be ready for your product to be delayed because the countries are arguing in terms of the agreements on tariffs and trade. It's going to potentially lead to a fall in trade. If the tariff is substantial, it's going to decline consumption from of imports and encourage you to produce domestic products, which is intended to benefit, to increase domestic production, to supply domestic markets, and the consumer can buy the product domestically. And your domestic producers are going to gain because they can increase their production, and they can also employ more people. So in this case, if you want your domestic producers to produce products, they can produce more, they can employ more, increase the community activity, and that's a good thing too if you really want to protect them from the foreign sector. From that part, companies and businesses and individuals feel strong about this policy. And the governments can gain by collecting some form of tax revenue. Who's affected the most? The consumer, in a sense that we have to pay a higher price, or your product may be delayed if it's coming from overseas. And there's going to be inefficiency loss in the market. Some consumers may not buy the product. There may be an increase in production that is inefficient because it can be produced somewhere else at a lower price. So there's associated side effects due to a tariff. Let's take a look at the effect of a tariff and the tariff model, and see how the tariff model significantly affects the imports of goods and the price in the world. So we're going back to our auto parts or our autos scenario. We have the domestic demand, domestic consumers buying products at a lower world price of $700, and I exaggerated the price here. The low world price, $700, is relatively low, that your domestic suppliers, your domestic producers are producing only 700 units, and their production is very low. You're importing a lot, 600 units from the foreign sector. Your consumers want 1,300, and out of those 1,300, your producers are only supplying 700. You have a lot of imports. Well, you want to tax those imports. This is a heavy tariff, $200 tariff, just to explain the concept. That's going to be added to the world price. If you set a tariff, you're going to add the price to the world price. That's a $200 tariff, world price of $700 plus a tariff. Now the world price is at $900. At $900 in the world post tariff, the producers now domestically can increase their production from 700 units to 900 units. That's how much they are now increase their production to 900 units. The consumers were buying 1,300 units before at a lower world price. They were buying 1,300 units at a lower world price. Now with the higher price at 900, the consumers on the demand for the good, they're going to only buy 1,100 units. 1,100 units. It's consumer demand at quantity of consumption demanded by the consumer at the tariff price of 900 or post-tariff is 1,100. Now consumers are demanding 1,100. Producers are supplying only 900 for domestic markets. The amount of imports coming from abroad are now narrowed to 200 imports down here, to 200 imports. So the tariff has done its job. The producers domestically are producing more, 700 units that went up to 900 units. They're supplying domestic markets with greater ability of goods. The consumers are going to respond by buying a little bit less because they now have to pay more, and the amount of imports have declined from 600 to 200 units. And the effects in the model, notice how it makes it really a little bit messy, because there's several things going on all at once. In real life, tariffs create messiness. It distort relationships. It affects international trade flows. It reduces imports, or it may not, because countries can do other policies. This is a case where it does reduce imports if the other country sits there and takes the tariff. So let's illustrate every area. If the price in the world is significantly low, the quantity supply is low, consumers are demanding a lot at a lower price, and we are importing significantly a lot of units. Once you set the tariff, there's going to be an increase in the price due to the price post-tariff, and the consumer is going to buy a lot less. The producers are going to increase production. The imports are going to drop after the tariff. And now we have all of these areas that were not there before. This increase of producer surplus on the supply curve, we have an increase to the producers. They have increased their production from QS to QST. Production increases. That increases their producer benefit because they can sell their product or more of the product to the consumers at a higher price. So that increases their net producer benefit, which is this pink area. The government taxes the imports, so the imports after tariff. They tax the import. Remember that a tariff is a tax on imports. So we have import revenue or government revenue from the tariff is this green area. And if you notice that yellow areas are considered deadweight loss, inefficiency in the market. This is more of an inefficiency in the market because the producers are producing products that they don't necessarily need to produce because they can produce it somewhere else in the world at a lower price. But you can say that the benefit outweighs the loss here because the producers are benefiting and they can employ people in the process. What's affected the most is the consumer. Quantity demanded drops. And some consumers may choose to decrease their consumption, which is the deadweight loss here, or their product may not arrive, or they may be forced to buy domestic at a higher price. The gains accrued more to the government in the form of government revenue, which is the tariff, the length times the width of this rectangle is the tariff times the amount of imports. Imports post-tariff times the tax of the tariff, that's the government revenue, and the producer benefits significantly. Government revenue increases, producer surplus increases, and the consumer benefit declines. Now, there's significant political views as to whether or not set trade restrictive policies. If you want to protect your domestic businesses against foreign competition, you may, but for the most part, let the market flow freely and do not set tariffs on trade. Arguments against trade protection includes we want to protect our national security from the international community or international countries if they are significantly affecting our well-being. If jobs are being lost to the foreign sector, we want to stimulate job creation and increase domestic employment by produce domestic and buy domestic argument. Some industries may be young, significantly young, and they cannot compete with the foreign sector. They're robbing, for example, quote unquote, they're robbing the ability to produce domestically. You want to protect your industries against anti-dumping behavior, the cheap foreign labor argument, and products are produced cheaper somewhere else, like in Bangladesh. Labor cost is like $2 in comparison to the U.S., which is like $7.50 at the federal level. At the state level, it's as expensive as $15 an hour in California. And you want to make sure to diversify your productivity. You don't want to be too dependent on the international sector. And some people are quite critical of international trade. Companies may exploit or may not exploit the resources in the area that they move to. So as long as the company is responsive when products are benefiting the consumers and wages are improving for the locals where they move to, I would argue that the benefits of trade are significantly greater than the potential losses. In the case of the United States, 93% of its economy it's based on other services within the United States. Only 7%, about 7%, approximately 7 to 8%, depends on the export-import sector. So it's not that big of a burden to the United States. Now, what are some well-known multilateral agreements across the world? Well, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, became the World Trade Organization that is responsible to monitor, adjudicate, and resolve trade disputes among the member nations in the world. We have the European Union, who consists of all of the European economies under one common currency, the euro. Although Great Britain wants to leave the European zone, I think they should stay, but they want to be independent. But we have GATT. GATT was in the early 1900s, mid 1900s, and eventually became the World Trade Organization that is responsible for making sure that trade agreements are respected, that the countries follow the agreements and stay within the free trade flow, and there's no significant violations and resolve trade disputes. The EU, it's one of the strongest unions in Europe. And then we have the North American Free Trade Agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico that promotes free trade and was recently signed again earlier this year in 2020. Was argued heavily in 2019, but they finally became heavily agree on the terms of trade. And by the way, the United States' #1 trading partner is Canada, and so don't be concerned as to whether or not other parties are heavily involved. Well, thank you everybody for joining the session today. Have a great afternoon, and I'll see you in the following session.